Downtown Manhattan, October 2023. The autumn wind swept through the narrow canyon of office buildings and courthouses, carrying with it the scent of roasted chestnuts from street vendors and the distant hum of a city that never paused to catch its breath. On the marble steps of the federal courthouse, where justice had been dispensed for over a century, two lives were about to collide in a way that neither could have predicted. Judge Margaret Holloway emerged from the heavy brass doors at precisely 6:15 in the evening, as she had done every workday for the past 12 years. Her black robe had been exchanged for a tailored charcoal suit, her graying hair pulled back in the same elegant chignon she had worn since her appointment to the bench. She carried a leather briefcase in one hand and her phone in the other, already scrolling through the endless stream of emails that demanded her attention. At 58, Margaret had built a reputation as one of the most respected federal judges in the Southern District of New York, known for her sharp intellect, unwavering principles, and decisions that often set precedents. Her colleagues called her formidable. Her critics called her cold. Neither description bothered her particularly. The courthouse steps were nearly empty at this hour, most of the day's traffic having dispersed hours ago. Margaret descended with practiced efficiency, her heels clicking against the stone in a steady rhythm. She had 3 blocks to walk to where her driver waited, a routine so ingrained that she barely registered her surroundings anymore. The homeless man sitting on the bottom step almost escaped her notice entirely. He was huddled against the ornate iron railing, wrapped in layers of mismatched clothing that might have been brown or gray or some unfortunate combination of both. A cardboard sign leaned against his knee, the writing too faded for Margaret to read in the dimming light. She had passed countless such individuals in her years in the city, had even ruled on cases involving homelessness and public policy. But she had long ago developed the armor that urban professionals acquire, the ability to see without really seeing, to acknowledge suffering without letting it penetrate too deeply. Margaret would have walked past him entirely if he hadn't spoken. His voice was rough, weathered by years of whatever circumstances had brought him to these steps, but there was something in it that made her pause. Not the usual request for spare change or a meal. Just 3 words, spoken so quietly she almost missed them. "Judge Holloway, please." She stopped, one foot on the sidewalk, the other still on the bottom step. Her legal mind immediately catalogued the possibilities. A defendant from a past case. A disgruntled family member seeking to confront her about a ruling. Perhaps someone mentally ill who had fixated on her from reading court documents. She had been trained in security protocols, knew she should keep walking, signaled to the courthouse guards who were visible through the glass doors behind them. But something made her turn. The man was looking directly at her, and in the amber glow of the streetlight that had just flickered on, she could see his face more clearly. He might have been anywhere from 40 to 70, the kind of agelessness that hardship creates. His skin was weathered and deeply lined, his beard unkempt, but his eyes held an unexpected clarity. They were blue, she noticed, a startling pale blue that seemed almost luminous in the gathering darkness. "You know my name," Margaret said, her voice carrying the authoritative tone she used in her courtroom. It wasn't a question. "I know more than that." He shifted slightly, and she could see him wince, as if the movement pained him. "I have something that belongs to you. That I need to give you. It's important." Every instinct told Margaret to leave, to alert security, to maintain the professional distance that had served her so well throughout her career. But there was something in the man's demeanor, in the careful way he spoke, that suggested this wasn't a threat or a scam. It felt, impossibly, like a plea. "What is it?" she asked, not moving closer but not walking away either. The man reached slowly into the pocket of his outermost jacket, a movement so deliberate that Margaret understood he was trying not to alarm her. He withdrew something small, and in the streetlight, she could see it was an envelope. Old, by the look of it. The paper was yellowed and creased, the kind that might have been white once but had aged to the color of weak tea. "This letter," he said, holding it out toward her. "It's been waiting 36 years to reach you." Margaret felt something cold slide down her spine, a sensation she couldn't immediately identify. 36 years. That would take her back to 1987. She would have been 22, fresh out of college, full of idealistic dreams about changing the world through law. A lifetime ago. I don't understand, she said, but even as she spoke, she found herself taking a step closer. Who are you? Where did you get that? My name doesn't matter much anymore, the man said, and there was a sadness in his voice that seemed to carry decades of weight. I've been called Tommy for longer than I can remember, so that'll do. As for where I got this, that's a longer story. One I'll tell you if you want to hear it. But first, you should read what's inside. It'll explain more than I can. Margaret's rational mind was screaming at her to walk away, to report this strange encounter and let security handle it. But her hand, acting almost of its own accord, reached out and took the envelope. The paper was soft with age, fragile beneath her fingers. There was no address on the front, just a name written in faded blue ink. Margaret Rose Holloway. Her full name, the one only her parents and a few old friends ever used. Margaret Rose. She hadn't been called that in years. Most people didn't even know she had a middle name. How did you? She began, but Tommy was already shaking his head. Read it, he said simply. Then if you want to know more, I'll be here. I've waited this long. I can wait a little longer. For a moment, Margaret stood frozen, the envelope in her hand, her entire carefully ordered world suddenly feeling unstable. Then, with a deep breath, she moved to stand under the brighter light of the courthouse entrance. Her fingers trembled slightly as she turned the envelope over. The flap was tucked in but not sealed, as if whoever had prepared it had wanted to make sure it could be opened easily after all these years. She slid out the letter inside. The paper matched the envelope, yellowed with age, covered in handwriting she recognized with a jolt that went through her like an electric shock. Neat, flowing script with distinctive loops on the lowercase letters. Handwriting she hadn't seen in 3.5 decades but would have known anywhere. The date at the top read August 15, 1987. My dearest Margaret Rose, it began, and suddenly she was 22 again, standing in a different city, in a different life, before everything had changed. Margaret's vision blurred for a moment, and she had to blink hard to clear it. Her heart was pounding in a way it hadn't in years, not even in the most intense moments of her courtroom. With hands that were no longer steady, she began to read. My dearest Margaret Rose, if you're reading this, then I'm gone, and enough time has passed that I hope the pain of it has faded, at least a little. I'm writing this on what might be my last clear day, while I still have the words and the courage to say what needs to be said. The doctors tell me I probably won't see Christmas, and while I want to rage against that, to fight it with everything I have, I also feel a strange peace knowing that I have this moment to write to you, to send you these words across whatever distance separates us now and in the future. Margaret's breath caught in her throat. She knew who had written this letter. The only person who had ever called her Margaret Rose with such tenderness. But it was impossible. She had to be misunderstanding. She read on, her eyes racing across the page. You're probably wondering why you're getting this so long after I'm gone. That's my doing, I'm afraid, and I hope you'll forgive me for it. I've arranged for this letter to be held and delivered to you on a specific date, under specific circumstances. Not right after I die, when the grief would be too fresh, too raw. And not to where you are now, because I know you, my darling girl, and I know that you'll have moved on, built a life, become the magnificent person I always knew you would be. This letter will find you when the universe decides you need it most, delivered by someone who has their own connection to this story, though you don't know it yet. The streetlight seemed to pulse in Margaret's peripheral vision, or maybe it was her own vision wavering. She pressed on. I need to tell you something I never had the courage to say while I was alive, something I should have told you that last summer we spent together, before everything fell apart between us. But I was young and scared and convinced that I was doing the right thing by staying silent. Now, facing the end, I realize that silence was the greatest mistake of my life. You deserved the truth, Margaret. You always deserved the truth. So here it is, finally, 3 decades too late but better than never. Margaret's hand moved to her mouth, pressing against her lips as if to hold back a sound that wanted to escape. Around her, the city continued its endless motion. Cars passed on the street. Somewhere a siren wailed. A couple walked by arguing about dinner reservations. But Margaret was no longer in Manhattan in 2023. She was in a cramped apartment in Boston in 1987, 22 years old and devastatingly in love with someone who had broken her heart so completely that she had spent the next 36 years carefully building walls to make sure it never happened again. The reason I ended things between us that August wasn't because I stopped loving you. God, Margaret, I never stopped loving you, not for a single moment. I ended things because I was sick, already sick even then, though I didn't know what it was yet. I was losing time, losing moments, finding bruises I couldn't explain and feeling tired in a way that scared me. I finally went to a doctor in September, after you'd gone to New York for law school. That's when they told me. Leukemia. Aggressive, advanced, with a prognosis that was bleak even with treatment. The letter slipped in Margaret's grasp, and she had to grab it quickly to keep it from falling. Leukemia. The word seemed to echo in her mind, bouncing off memories she had locked away decades ago. Sarah. Beautiful, brilliant Sarah Chen, who had been Margaret's first love, her college sweetheart, the person she had planned to build a life with. Sarah, who had ended their relationship with a coldness that had shattered Margaret, who had refused to explain, who had simply said it was over and walked away. I know what you're thinking, the letter continued, as if Sarah had anticipated every thought Margaret would have across the gulf of years. You're thinking I should have told you, that we could have faced it together. And you're right. But Margaret, you had just gotten into Columbia Law School. You were about to start the life you dreamed of since you were a little girl. You were going to change the world, make it better, fight for justice and equality and all the beautiful things we used to talk about until 3 in the morning in your dorm room. How could I ask you to give that up? How could I let you throw away your future to watch me die? Margaret's vision blurred again, and this time the tears fell freely, tracking down her cheeks. And dripping onto the aged paper. She didn't try to stop them. Through the moisture, she kept reading. I thought I was being noble, Margaret. I thought I was saving you from the pain of watching me waste away, from having to choose between your dreams and me. I convinced myself that a clean break, a sudden ending with no explanation, would hurt less in the long run than a slow goodbye. I was so sure I was doing the right thing. So sure that you would move on, find someone else, build the incredible life you deserved without being weighed down by grief and loss before you'd even really begun. The courthouse steps beneath Margaret's feet seemed unsteady, as if the solid marble had turned to water. She gripped the railing with one hand, the letter with the other, forcing herself to continue. I was wrong, Margaret. I see that now, here at the end. I robbed you of the choice. I decided for both of us how our story would end. And worse, I let you believe that I had stopped loving you, that you hadn't been enough, that something about you had driven me away. I let you carry that burden, and for that, I am more sorry than words can ever express. You were always enough. You were everything. You were the best thing that ever happened to me, and leaving you, even with the reasons I had, was like cutting out my own heart. Margaret made a sound that was half sob, half gasp. A couple passing by looked at her with concern, but she waved them away, unable to speak, unable to do anything but stand there clutching a letter from a ghost and feeling her carefully constructed world crumbling around her. The treatment failed, as the doctor said it probably would. I've been in and out of hospitals, getting weaker, losing myself bit by bit. Your mother has been wonderful, coming to visit even though I know it's hard for her to see me like this. I made her promise not to tell you, to let you live your life without this shadow. She argued with me about it, said you had a right to know, but in the end she respected my wishes. If you're angry with her for keeping my secret, please don't be. She was honoring what I asked of her, even though it went against every instinct she had. Margaret's mother. Who had died 8 years ago, taking her secrets with her to the grave. Or so Margaret had thought. Now she understood the sadness she had sometimes seen in her mother's eyes, the way she had once started to say something about Sarah and then stopped, shaking her head. The way she had held Margaret a little tighter on certain anniversaries, for reasons Margaret had never understood. There's one more thing you need to know, and this is the hardest part to write. Remember that last week we spent together, that weekend we went to the Cape. The little cottage we rented that was practically falling down, but we didn't care because we were together. That weekend gave me a gift, Margaret, one I never had the chance to tell you about. Margaret's heart began to pound even harder. That weekend. Early August 1987. She remembered it with perfect clarity because it had been the last happy memory before everything fell apart. They had been so young, so in love, so certain they had forever ahead of them. I found out I was pregnant in late August, just days before I got my diagnosis. The doctor said continuing the pregnancy with the aggressive treatment I needed would be dangerous, possibly fatal. But Margaret, I couldn't terminate it. This baby was ours, a piece of you and me, and I couldn't let it go. I chose to delay treatment, to take the risk, because I wanted to give you this one last gift, even if you never knew it came from me. The world stopped. Margaret's breath stopped. Everything stopped except the words on the page in front of her. I had a daughter, Margaret. Our daughter. Born on May 3, 1988. Beautiful and perfect and with your eyes. I held her for 3 days, memorized every inch of her face, and then I gave her up for adoption. I was dying, I had no family who could raise her, and I wanted her to have the life she deserved, with parents who could give her everything I couldn't. Your mother helped me arrange it, found a good family, made sure the records were sealed but that there would be a way, someday, for connections to be made if the universe willed it. Margaret's knees gave out. She sank down onto the courthouse steps, no longer caring about her expensive suit or her professional dignity or anything except the words she was reading. A daughter. She had a daughter. Sarah had carried their child, given birth, given her up, and died without ever telling Margaret any of it. I know this is a shock, Margaret, and I know I had no right to make these decisions without you. But I did what I thought was best at the time. I wanted our daughter to have a chance at a happy life, and I wanted you to have the chance to become the person you were meant to be without being forced into parenthood before you were ready. I left instructions that when the time was right, when enough years had passed, you would be told. Not to burden you with obligations, but to give you the choice I never gave you before. The choice to know, to seek out this part of your past if you want to, or to leave it be if that's what's best for you. The letter was almost finished now, just a few more lines on the page. There's a man named Thomas Chen, my cousin, though I doubt you remember him. He was just a kid when we were together, awkward and shy, always hanging around my apartment because his home life was rough. I asked him to hold on to this letter, to wait for a sign that the time was right to give it to you. I told him to watch for you from a distance, not to interfere with your life, but to wait until he saw you at a moment when you might need to know the truth. I trust his judgment, even if he's not much more than a teenager now. He's a good person, Margaret, with a kind heart, and I hope life treats him better than it treated me. Margaret's eyes flew to the man sitting a few feet away on the steps. Tommy. Thomas Chen. Sarah's cousin. She stared at him as puzzle pieces began to fall into place. The same pale blue eyes that Sarah had. The way he had known her name, had waited on these specific steps. The letter concluded with words that broke Margaret's heart all over again. I don't know what kind of woman you've become, Margaret Rose, but I like to imagine you're still the person I fell in love with. Still fighting for what's right, still believing the world can be better, still carrying that fierce heart that made me love you more than I thought it was possible to love anyone. I hope you found happiness. I hope you found love again, the kind you deserve. I hope you've had a beautiful life, even if I couldn't be part of it. And if you choose to seek out our daughter, if you want to know the young woman she's become, then I hope that brings you joy. But if it's too much, if it's too painful or complicated or disruptive to the life you've built, then I hope you can forgive me for this final burden and let it go with peace in your heart. You owe me nothing, Margaret. You never did. All I ever wanted was your happiness. I love you. I loved you then, I love you now, and I'll love you beyond whatever comes next. Forever yours, Sarah. Margaret sat on the cold marble steps, tears streaming down her face, her entire understanding of her own history rewriting itself with every passing second. 36 years. For 36 years she had believed Sarah had simply stopped loving her, had chosen to end their relationship for reasons Margaret had never understood. She had carried that rejection like a scar on her heart, had let it shape her relationships, her choices, her entire approach to love and intimacy. She had built walls and called it wisdom. She had chosen solitude and called it independence. She had buried her heart so deep she had almost forgotten it was there at all. And all along, Sarah had loved her. Had been dying. Had given birth to their daughter. Had carried all of it alone, out of a misguided sense of nobility that Margaret wanted to rage against even as she understood it. She looked up at Tommy, who was watching her with those eerily familiar eyes. In the streetlight, she could see Sarah in his features now that she was looking for it. The same high cheekbones, the same way of holding his head slightly tilted when he was thinking. How long? Margaret asked, her voice rough with emotion. How long have you been watching for the right moment? Tommy shifted, pulling his layers of clothing tighter around himself. I watched for 5 years while I still had a life. I was doing okay back then, had a job, a place. But then things went wrong. Lost my job in the recession, lost my apartment, lost myself for a while. I spent years in a bad place, Margaret. Drugs, mostly. The kind that make you forget you ever had dreams. He looked down at his hands. But I never forgot Sarah's letter. Even when I had nothing else, I kept it safe. Carried it with me everywhere. It was like as long as I had it, I still had a purpose, you know. Something I needed to do, someone I needed to be for, even if that person was gone. Why now? Margaret asked. Why tonight, after all these years? I saw you, Tommy said simply. I've been camped around this area for a few weeks, and I've seen you come and go from that courthouse. And today, I don't know. Something about the way you looked when you came out. Like you were carrying the whole world on your shoulders and it was getting too heavy. Like maybe you needed to remember that there was more to life than the weight you were carrying. Sarah told me I'd know when the time was right, and today, I knew. Margaret wanted to tell him he was wrong, that she was fine, that her life was exactly what she wanted it to be. But she couldn't make the words come, because they wouldn't have been true. She had been thinking, just this morning, about how empty her beautiful apartment felt when she came home at night. How she couldn't remember the last time someone had touched her with genuine affection. How she was 58 years old and respected and accomplished and fundamentally alone. The daughter, Margaret said, her voice barely above a whisper. Do you know what happened to her? Where she is? Tommy reached into his jacket again and pulled out another envelope, this one newer, the paper white and crisp. Sarah left instructions with your mother. After your mother passed, the information was held by a lawyer, sealed until either you came looking for it or until this letter was delivered to you, whichever came first. I went to the lawyer last week, told him it was time. He gave me this to give you. Margaret took the second envelope with shaking hands. Inside was a single sheet of paper with a name, an address, and a phone number. But before she could read it, Tommy spoke again. Her name is Emma, he said quietly. Emma Kate Morrison. She's 35 now. Lives in Brooklyn, works as a public defender. Married, 2 kids. Your mother kept track of her all these years, made sure she was okay, even though she never interfered. I've seen her, Margaret. Just from a distance, you understand. I wanted to know what kind of person came from Sarah's love for you. She's good people. She fights for the ones who don't have anyone else to fight for them. Kind of like someone I used to know. The description hit Margaret like a physical blow. A public defender. fighting for people who couldn't fight for themselves. It was what Margaret had dreamed of becoming when she was young, before ambition and prestige had led her in other directions, before she had traded the idealism of a public defender's office for the power and influence of the federal bench. "She doesn't know about me?" Margaret asked. "She knows she was adopted, had a good family who loved her and was always open about it. But the records were sealed. Sarah wanted her to have a normal childhood without any confusion about who her parents were. She wanted to give Emma the family she never could have given her. But she also wanted to leave the door open, for when Emma was old enough to make her own choices, or for when you might want to know her. If you ever do. If. Such a small word for such an enormous decision. Margaret looked down at the paper in her hand. An address in Brooklyn, not far from here. A phone number she could call right now if she wanted to. A daughter she had never known existed, who had grown up and built a life and become a person without Margaret having any part of it. The professional part of Margaret's mind immediately began calculating the complications. The questions it would raise. The disruption to Emma's life and her own. The impossibility of explaining to her colleagues and friends that she suddenly had a 35-year-old daughter she'd never mentioned. The legal tangles, the emotional chaos, the sheer overwhelming complexity of it all. But there was another part of her, a part she had thought long dead, that was whispering something different. This was her daughter. Hers and Sarah's. A piece of the love she had thought was lost forever. A connection to the person she had been before life had hardened her, before she had learned to protect herself by feeling less, caring less, risking less. "What happened to you, Tommy?" Margaret asked, looking at the man who had carried this burden for so long. "After you lost everything, why did you end up here?" Tommy smiled, a sad expression that didn't quite reach his eyes. "I guess I figured Sarah gave me a purpose once, even if she's been gone for most of my life. This letter, this mission, it kept me going through the worst times. Gave me a reason to stay alive even when I didn't want to. I knew I had something important to do, even if I didn't know exactly when I'd do it. That's more than a lot of people have, Margaret. That's more than nothing." Margaret felt something crack inside her chest, a fissure in the armor she had worn for so long. Here was a man who had lost everything, who lived on the streets with nothing but the clothes he wore and the mission Sarah had given him, and he was talking about purpose and meaning with more conviction than Margaret had felt in years. "Come with me," Margaret said suddenly, standing up and brushing off her suit. "I'm taking you to get a meal and a hotel room for tonight. And tomorrow we're going to figure out what resources you need. Housing, medical care, job training, whatever it takes." Tommy shook his head. "You don't need to do that. I delivered the letter. That's all Sarah asked of me." "Maybe," Margaret said, and her voice had the firm tone that made lawyers in her courtroom straighten their spines. "But I'm asking you for more. I'm asking you to let me help you, because Sarah cared about you enough to trust you with the most important thing in her life. That means something. That means you matter." For a moment, Tommy just looked at her, and Margaret saw the intelligence that still lived behind the weathered face, the person he might have been if life had dealt him a different hand. Then, slowly, he nodded. "Okay," he said quietly. "Okay." As they walked together down the street, an unlikely pair that drew curious stares from passers-by, Margaret found herself holding the two envelopes like they were the most precious things in the world. In one, a letter from a ghost that had rewritten her entire past. In the other, the possibility of a future she had never imagined. The restaurant Margaret chose was quiet and warm, the kind of place where the staff was discreet and the booths were private. She settled Tommy in a corner spot and ordered enough food for 3 people, remembering how inadequate a single meal was when someone had been going hungry for too long. While he ate, slowly at first and then with increasing appetite, she excused herself and went to the restroom, where she finally allowed herself to fall apart completely. She braced her hands on the sink and let the sobs come, deep wrenching sounds that she muffled against her arm. Grief for Sarah, for the years they could have had together, for the goodbye she had never gotten to say. Rage at the choices Sarah had made, the silence she had kept, even while understanding why she had done it. Wonder at the existence of Emma, this daughter who shared her DNA, who had become a person with her own life and loves and dreams. And underneath it all, a terrible, aching loneliness that Margaret had been pretending she didn't feel for longer than she cared to admit. When she finally composed herself and returned to the table, Tommy had cleaned his plate and was drinking coffee with both hands wrapped around the cup, as if drawing warmth from it. "Thank you," he said simply. "I can't remember the last time someone showed me this kind of kindness." Margaret sat down across from him. "Tell me about Sarah," she said. "Tell me about the last months. Your mother would never talk about it, and I never pushed because I was angry. Angry that Sarah had left me, angry that everyone seemed to know something I didn't. But I'm not angry anymore. I just want to know." So Tommy told her. About Sarah's courage in the face of certain death, the way she had faced it with grace and humor even when the pain was overwhelming. About the pregnancy, how Sarah had glowed despite being sick, how she had talked to her belly and played music and read poetry to the daughter she knew she would have to let go. About the birth, which Sarah had barely survived, and the 3 days she had spent with Emma before the adoption was finalized. "She made me promise to photograph every second," Tommy said. "I was only 17, but I had a good camera, and I took hundreds of pictures. Sarah and Emma together. Emma sleeping, Emma crying. Emma being perfect. Sarah made me promise to give them to you too, along with the letter. They're in storage, been there for years. I kept paying for the unit even when I had nothing, took odd jobs, did whatever I had to do to keep it. I couldn't let Sarah's memories disappear. I want to see them," Margaret said, and her voice was fierce. "I want to see everything." They made plans to retrieve the photographs the next day, and then Margaret called her driver and gave Tommy the address of a hotel she knew. Not the best in the city, but clean and safe and far better than the streets. She paid for a week in advance and gave him cash for necessities, extracting a promise that he would meet her at her office the following afternoon. Alone in her car on the way home, Margaret pulled out the paper with Emma's information again. Emma Kate Morrison. A public defender with 2 children of her own, which meant Margaret was, impossibly, a grandmother. The thought was so absurd that she almost laughed, but the sound caught in her throat and came out as something closer to a sob. She could call the number right now. Could introduce herself, explain everything, and hope that Emma wouldn't hang up or think it was a cruel prank. But something made her hesitate. This wasn't a decision to make at night, emotionally raw and exhausted. This was something that deserved thought, care, and planning. But she did allow herself to open her laptop when she got home and search for Emma's name. A Facebook page came up, set to public. Margaret clicked on it with trembling fingers. The woman who smiled out from the profile picture had Sarah's mouth and chin, that same slightly crooked smile that had made Margaret's heart skip. But the eyes were different. They were Margaret's eyes, the exact shade of dark brown, with the same slight downward tilt at the outer corners. Emma's hair was longer than either of her mothers had worn theirs, dark and wavy and pulled back in a messy ponytail. She was beautiful in a way that was uniquely her own, a blend of 2 people who had loved each other desperately in another lifetime. Margaret scrolled through the public posts. Pictures of Emma with a kind-faced man who must be her husband. Photos of 2 children, a boy about 7 and a girl maybe 4, building sandcastles and blowing out birthday candles. Posts about cases Emma was working on, frustrated rants about the justice system, passionate pleas for donations to various causes. This was someone who cared deeply, who fought hard, who had built a life full of love and purpose. This was her daughter. Margaret closed the laptop and sat in the darkness of her apartment, surrounded by expensive furniture and awards and framed diplomas that suddenly felt like hollow accomplishments. What had she built in 36 years? A career, yes. A reputation. But what else? Where was the love that Emma seemed to have in abundance? Where were the connections, the family, the life full of messy, complicated, beautiful human relationships? She had told herself for years that she was content with solitude, that her work was enough, that she didn't need the complications of intimate relationships. But sitting here with Sarah's letter in her hand and the knowledge of Emma's existence burning in her chest, Margaret had to admit the truth she had been avoiding for decades. She was lonely. She had been lonely since the day Sarah walked away, and she had convinced herself that loneliness was the same as independence, that being alone was a choice rather than a consequence. That night, Margaret didn't sleep. She read Sarah's letter over and over until she had memorized every word, every loop of the handwriting, every place where Sarah's pen had pressed harder into the paper as if the emotion behind the words had become too much to contain. She thought about the last time she had seen Sarah alive, the terrible argument they'd had when Sarah had refused to explain why she was ending things. Margaret had said cruel things, things she had regretted for years, and now she would never be able to apologize. Never be able to say that she understood, that she forgave, that she wished Sarah had trusted her with the truth. But maybe, Margaret thought as the sky began to lighten outside her window, maybe there was still a chance for something. Not to undo the past or to reclaim what was lost, but to reach forward into the future, to meet this daughter who existed because of a love that had been real and true even if it had been brief. To be honest about who she was and what she wanted, for perhaps the first time in decades. The next morning, Margaret called her clerk and cleared her calendar for the day. She met Tommy at the storage facility he directed her to in Queens, a grimy building in a neighborhood Margaret would never have ventured into under normal circumstances. Tommy led her to a small unit on the third floor, paid for under a name that wasn't his own but that he had apparently been maintaining for 36 years. Inside were boxes, carefully labeled in handwriting Margaret now recognized as Sarah's. Photographs. Letters. Medical records. And clothing, small and soft and smelling faintly of lavender even after all these years. Baby clothes that Sarah had bought for a daughter she knew she couldn't keep. Margaret sat on the concrete floor of the storage unit and went through it all, piece by piece. The photographs Tommy had taken showed Sarah with Emma, and even through the evidence of illness, even with the obvious pain and exhaustion in Sarah's face, the love was unmistakable. The way Sarah looked at Emma, the way she held her, the tenderness in every gesture. Margaret traced her fingers over these images of a moment she had been denied, and felt grief wash over her again. But there were other photographs too, ones Margaret hadn't expected. Pictures of Margaret and Sarah together, from their years in college. Margaret had thrown away all her photos of Sarah in the immediate aftermath of their breakup, a decision she had regretted but never admitted to. Now here they were again, preserved by Sarah through everything. The two of them at a protest march, holding hands and laughing. At a coffee